Let's take a look at case study number 2. This is Joe. Joe has a 3.7 unweighted GPA and a 29 ACT. He lives in Phoenix, Arizona. He has a single mother who will be contributing $5,000 per year to his college costs. He exceeds all Ivy recruiting standards. So he's run 10.65 his junior year in the 100 meters, which is equivalent to 47.5 in the 400, 407 mile, 24-foot long jump, 6'9" high jump, 60-foot shot put, or 205-foot javelin. So Joe's a stud. Everybody in the Ivy League is going to want him. There's pretty much no doubt about that. And a lot of Division I programs all over the place are going to want him. Why might an athlete apply regular decision? So Joe is going to be a regular decision applicant for us, so we can try to see what that process looks like. There are a lot of reasons why an athlete might find themselves applying regular decision rather than early decision. They may not have made a decision on where they want to go before the early decision deadline. They may not believe that they have a chance of being admitted until they finally speak with an Ivy League coach. They may have only just begun being recruited by an Ivy League coach after the early decision deadline. And many athletes don't even have the Ivy League on their radar until a coach contacts them. There are also too many athletes for Ivy League coaches to reach out to everyone who might be a good fit. So by the time early decision is over, there are still unfound qualified athletes. And some Ivies will be done recruiting by early decision deadline, but others will be recruiting past the regular decision deadline and sometimes all the way into February. So Joe's recruiting process is going to begin in March of his junior year. He lives in Arizona and exceeds all Ivy recruiting standards in March of his junior year, but has not thought about going out of state for college. He's thinking he wants to be a Sun Devil, Arizona State all the way. It's in his hometown of Phoenix, and it just carries a lot of weight to go to Arizona State if you're from Phoenix. 5 of the 8 Ivy coaches try to find Joe on social media, but he doesn't have any social media pages, so they can't find him. One Ivy League coach goes as far as to call the athletic director at Joe's high school and leaves a message but never hears back. Pro tip: if you don't have an easily searchable public Instagram account that is professional and gives off good first impression vibes, then go ahead and create a public Instagram account called your first name, last name, and then your event. An example would be Joe Johnson 100 meters, or Joe Johnson sprints, or Jill James 800 meters, or Jill James run. You want to make yourself as easy to find as possible for college coaches. Because all college coaches are in season at the same time that you're in season, when you're hitting your PRs during the indoor and outdoor season, these college coaches are also in the competitive season. They're traveling to meets with their team. They're under pressure to perform, but they're also expected to be recruiting at that time. So if you are a difficult athlete to find online, you may not be recruited because they're just going to take the path of least resistance and continue recruiting the athletes that are easy to find, especially at that time in the season when they're very busy. They're most likely going to revisit some of those tough to reach athletes, the ones they couldn't find during the season. Maybe in the summer, they're going to revisit and try to see if they can find them through other means, but you don't want to be one of those people. You're much better off being easy to find so that they don't have to work hard to find you. Okay, now we're in May. So that was March. We've jumped over April, and now we're into May of Joe's junior year. Joe places second at the Arizona State meet behind a senior who's going to Arizona State on a full ride. So everyone's talking, oh, yeah, the guy who won, he's going to ASU on a full ride. So Joe's thinking, okay, well, I'm in the range for a full ride. I know that guy's got a full ride, so I'll probably be able to go to ASU for a full ride. Now, on to June and July, because Joe is not being very proactive here, as you can tell. The months are flying by and he's hitting great marks, but he hasn't really done anything in this recruiting process quite yet, other than be a stud athlete. Kansas State, Texas Tech, and Cal Berkeley coaches all reach out to Joe, but he isn't really interested. He's still daydreaming about his full ride to ASU. Pro tip: don't take anything for granted in the recruiting process. Just because someone else got a full ride, and I'm using my air quotes because that's the rumor, right? They got a full ride. They got a full ride. That doesn't always mean that they actually got a full ride and are paying nothing to go to college. And if they had similar athletic achievements to you, that doesn't necessarily mean that you'll also get a full ride. They may not need you because they have the other guy that they got the year before. Or This year, they might find somebody who's even better than you. You might have run 1065 and they gave a full ride to a guy who ran 1065 last year. But this year, they might find a guy from California who's run 1051 and they give the full ride to that guy. And you may be left there with one quarter tuition and you're thinking, how did the guy get a full ride with the same marks last year? So it's not a sure bet. So don't take anything for granted. That's why it's important to keep your options open and follow through with other coaches. Talk to the coaches, even at schools that maybe you're not that interested in. Because think about it, even if you speak with some coaches that are at schools that you're not that interested in, it gives you practice in talking to coaches. And it's a low pressure practice situation because you're not that interested in that school. So speak with that coach if you feel like you're fumbling it or putting your best foot forward, that's okay because you didn't want to go there anyway. But you might be surprised as well because sometimes a place that you may not have even been that interested in might end up being really awesome. Another thing is that full ride that Joe heard that other senior got, it might just be a rumor, right? Each year, a team's athletic scholarship picture is different, so you can't assume anything. It's important to be active in the college search process and give yourself as many opportunities as possible. That's how you make your own luck. Moving on to August. So this is right about when Joe's going to be starting his senior year. Yale and Dartmouth coaches finally reach out to Joe through the athletic director at his school. They had tried when their collegiate season had wrapped up to reach Joe, but they both had athletes at the NCAA championships in June. So by the time they reached out to his high school, it had closed for the summer. During Joe's outdoor season, when he was hitting great marks in March, April, May, some of these Ivy coaches had tried to reach him over social media, but they couldn't find him anywhere. So they continued the recruiting process with some of those easy to reach student athletes. And then they ended up trying to reach out when their season ended and they stopped traveling to meets. It was already June. So after the NCAA championships were over, the Yale and the Dartmouth coaches reached out to Joe's school, but the school was closed down for the summer. Okay. So they couldn't get a hold of the athletic director. And so at this point, now in August, finally school opens back up in Phoenix. And they're finally able to get a hold of that athletic director and get Joe's contact information. Joe has no interest in freezing to death in the mountains of New Hampshire when he's used to Phoenix big city life. However, New Haven sounds interesting, and he almost can't believe the coach when he tells Joe that his grades and SATs are good enough to be admitted to Yale. This is classic. 29 ACT kids oftentimes don't expect that they can go to the Ivy League or that they can go to some of these elite schools, but if they're a really good athlete, they're definitely going to have a chance. The kid from his high school that went to Yale a couple years before was the valedictorian, and Joe is currently barely in the top 20% of his high school class, so he didn't think that it was going to be possible for him. But the Yale coach tells him with a support slot, it is possible. And he begins the financial aid and pre-read process with Yale. In September, Joe takes his official visit to Arizona State. The ASU coach is wishy-washy about whether or not he will have any athletic scholarships available. The total cost of attendance at ASU is $34,000 for in-state, but he finds that he's eligible for $10,000 in academic aid, bringing the annual cost down to $24,000 before any athletic scholarship. Joe receives his financial aid pre-read from Yale and is shocked to learn that he will only need to pay $13,000 per year to attend Yale. Now, Joe has a single mom, and she's making pretty good money if Yale determines that she's able to pay $13,000 a year. But a lot of times people will look at the sticker price of the Ivy League schools and see between $70,000 and $80,000 and think, I can't do that. But again, Joe checked to see how his financial aid was going to be, and he's only going to have to pay 13, which really isn't that bad, especially since his mom is going to help him pay for 5,000 a year. So he's looking at paying about $8,000 a year to get an Ivy League degree at Yale. And so 8,000 a year, that's $24,000 over 4 years. He can probably make a good chunk of that in his summer jobs and if he has a job on campus. He commits to an official visit late in October with Yale. He can't visit in September because his football season is jam-packed. This is something else to consider. If you play soccer or you run cross country or you play football, it's really hard to travel out to these official visits. So you want to do this stuff in advance. I can't say that enough. You've got to plan in advance to give yourself the best possible chance of having the outcome that you want to have in your college process. Some of planning in advance for your fall sports season would be speaking with your coach ahead of time, with that soccer coach, that cross country coach, that football coach, to see what weekends would be best for you to travel and then try to plan your travel around those weekends. Also, it is possible to take official visits midweek. We're on to October of Joe's senior year. The ASU coach ends up offering 30% scholarship, bringing the cost of attendance down to around 13.8 after academic aid and athletic scholarship, which is still more than Yale. Pro tip: athletic scholarship is not as valuable as financial aid. Athletic scholarship is tied to you being on the team, whereas financial aid is tied to you being a student at the college. So if something were to happen and you're no longer on the team, so if you get badly injured and you can't compete anymore, or you're not academically eligible, you can lose your athletic scholarship and your financial aid will stay with you, unlike your athletic scholarship. So even if you leave the team at Yale, your financial aid will stay with you, which is why $1 of financial aid is worth more than $1 of athletic scholarship. Joe takes his official visit to Yale and has trouble imagining himself there. He still prefers ASU, but he is intrigued by the Ivy League. October continued. He decides to reach out to a couple of other Ivies in big cities. So now that he's gotten his interest peaked, before he was thinking ASU all the way. Then the Ivy League came into the picture. He started getting a little interested in that. Now his interest is peaked. He likes the idea of the Ivy League, but he didn't like Yale that much. So now he's starting to get a little proactive, which is awesome, and he's going to open some opportunities for himself. He decides to reach out to a couple of other Ivies in bigger cities. He's never been to New York City, and he would love to go. He also wants the chance to run up the steps from the Rocky movie in Philadelphia on his Penn visit. So another good opportunity to go across the country and visit a couple big cities that he's never been to, and maybe he wants to go to school there. Both the Columbia coach and Penn coach immediately start the academic and financial aid pre-read process with Joe. He would be an excellent recruit for them. The Princeton coach ends up calling Joe when another high school student athlete who was also on Joe's Yale visit committed to Princeton the following weekend and shared Joe's phone number with the Princeton coach in hopes that he would have Joe as a teammate at Princeton. This is not unusual at all. If you're taking a number of visits in the Ivy League, official visits in the fall, you're going to see a lot of the same people. So you might go on a visit to Cornell and then you go on a visit to Princeton and you might be hanging out with a few of the same people that were taking both those visits. So anyway, somebody who was on Joe's Yale visit and then took a visit to Princeton and then committed to Princeton gave Joe's information to the Princeton coach because he was like, man, this guy's Joe is really good. Let me give you his phone number, which is a huge win for that Princeton coach to have the chance to be able to figure out a way to contact him because the Princeton coach maybe had never found a way to contact Joe or had never really tried. Joe declines continuing the recruiting process with Princeton because of its suburban location. He's looking for a more urban location. Sensing Joe's lack of enthusiasm for Yale, the Yale coach offers Joe a support slot and gives him a deadline of October 20th to decide, to try to force his hand and also give the coach the chance to offer Joe's slot to his next recruit if Joe does not accept. So, in the way that we remember, the Columbia coach offered a slot to Jill and gave her a deadline. Now the same thing is happening. The Yale coach is sensing maybe Joe's not all in on this. Why don't I see if I can put some time pressure on him and see if the Yale name and the Ivy League opportunity is something that feels too good to give up. If I can make him come to Yale because he's scared, essentially, which is the game that's being played. Joe schedules his official visit with Columbia and Penn in November. The Columbia coach explains that they will still be recruiting through regular decisions, so there's no hurry for Joe to make a decision until after his visit at the end of November. As the November 8th NLI date draws close, the ASU coach pressures Joe into signing before his visits in November with Penn and Columbia. The ASU coach explains that if Joe's performance is strong his freshman year, he could get more scholarship in future years. Pro tip: you can't see the future. While you may think and you should believe that you're going to be the person who improves and earns more scholarship money, every athlete is one twisted ankle away from having a bust of a year. And so go for the guaranteed money. Okay. So don't expect that you're going to get more money in athletic scholarship in the future because your performance is so good. it's more important to take guaranteed money up front because you never know what's going to happen. And financial aid is better than athletic scholarship, as I said before. But athletic scholarship is great, especially if maybe your price of attending a university where you're getting athletic scholarship and academic aid and maybe some financial aid, especially if you're going to be paying a lot less money to go there than to go somewhere else. We're still in October. Joe reaches out to the Penn and Columbia coach to confirm that he will have a support slot if he commits, and both coaches confirm that he will have a support slot. So, because he has this time pressure from Yale to commit by October 20th, Joe does a smart thing. He not only lines up his official visits with Penn and Columbia, but he also confirms that he will have a support slot with both of those schools. So now Joe feels comfortable and he goes ahead and declines the support slot at Yale. Pro tip: don't close a door without certainty that another door will be open for you. Joe played it right in this instance by leveraging his Yale offer and deadline to make sure he still had an Ivy support slot before declining the Yale offer. In Joe's case, he is so good that almost any Ivy will offer a support slot. But if an athlete has one offer of support from an Ivy, but their top choice is withholding a support slot, it's a good idea to try to leverage an offer of support to get another. Just make sure you do it in a respectful way and be ready for them to say no or that they cannot offer support until a later date. So, in this scenario, Joe leveraged his support slot and the deadline to get offers for other support slots. But it was kind of easy for Joe because they're going to want him in either way. If you have a support slot at Cornell, but you really want to go to Dartmouth, talk to the Dartmouth coach and let them know that you have a support slot at Cornell and what can they do for you? Can you get me a support slot also? You can tell them straight up, I would prefer to come to Dartmouth, but it's going to be hard to turn down the support slot at Cornell. And you can put some time pressure on them to give you what you want. October continued. Joe receives his financial aid pre-read from Columbia and Penn and submits his Yale financial aid read to them for a match. Again, Joe's being smart here. Joe alerts the ASU coach that he is still interested but not ready to sign on November 8th since he still has 2 more visits to go. The Penn coach explains to Joe that even though his official visit is after the November 1 early decision deadline, the November 1 date can be stretched for student athletes. As long as Joe has his application submitted by November 15th, he can still apply early decision. With his visit to Penn scheduled for November 17th, Joe plans to submit his application on November 15th to slide in under the extended early decision deadline in case he loves the visit in the next few days. This is really savvy work by Joe, and also it's really smart for the Penn coach. The coach always wants to have the recruiting class wrapped up as soon as possible because they want to put this class behind them, focus on the season that they're in, because in November, they're about to start the indoor season. And if they're cross country and track coach, then they're just wrapping up the cross country season and about to start the indoor season. So this is not unusual in the Ivy League and elsewhere, where the hard deadlines, where it looks like a really hard deadline for early decision applications, it can be stretched for student athletes. So Joe's applying even before he's going to Penn, which is a good idea because he can switch his application to early if he decides. I can't say that every university will allow this, but if you talk to the coach, because you can have an application into multiple schools. You can put your application into 5 Ivy League schools that you're interested in all before the early decision deadline. But you can have them in marked as regular decision. If you're taking 5 official visits to 5 Ivy League schools, you can apply to all 5 of those schools and have it in your application marked regular decision for each one of those schools. And then when you determine which school you want to go to, if it's still before the early decision deadline, you can go back to your application and just recheck early decision. And now you're done, right? So you can have all your applications done in the summer for the schools that you're going on official visits with, and then you can just change your regular decision category to early decision, and then you're done. Pro tip: we've already covered this a little bit. The admissions deadlines are soft for athletes, and often they are softer than you'd imagine for regular applicants as well. Supported student athletes can often submit their applications 2 or 3 weeks after the early decision deadline, and their regular decision application up to 2 months after the deadline but it might require the coach requesting to have the application portal reopened for the athlete. Likewise, it's not uncommon for the application portal to stay open for 24 hours or more after the stated deadline. So while students are freaking out about submitting before midnight on the deadline, in actuality, they likely have a little wiggle room. Admissions departments often do this to avoid masses of emails from terrified applicants trying to submit their applications past the deadline. Okay, so you don't want to rely on the fact that the application portal is likely going to stay open past the deadline, but it's something to note. And certainly these soft deadlines for athletes are important. And it's not something that I would really ask a coach about, and it's not something that I would really plan on. I would recommend that you try to have your process done as early as possible so you never have to use any extra time after the deadline, but it's something to note that it does exist. Moving on to November of Joe's senior year. November 1 early decision deadline and the November 8 NLI signing day pass with no decision from Joe. Joe submits his application to Penn on November 15th, the last day to submit for student athletes at Penn. Joe attends his official visit at Penn and knows almost immediately that he wants to attend, but he has his official visit with Columbia scheduled for the following weekend and doesn't want to miss it. He tells the Penn coach that he is extremely appreciative of the work the coach put in for such a great visit and is interested in attending, but he feels like he owes it to himself and the Columbia coach who has already planned his visit to see Columbia for himself. November continued. The Penn coach tells Joe that he needs to know the day after Joe's Columbia visit if he is committing to Penn, and that it still will not be too late to change his application to early decision. He advises Joe to keep his application coded regular decision. That means just check the box is checked as regular decision. And then he can go change the coding to early decision the day after his Columbia visit if he decides he wants to commit to Penn. Joe visits Columbia and realizes that he is sure he wants to go to school in New York City. So while despite loving Penn and Philadelphia, he realizes he wants to go to New York City. He commits to Columbia the day after he arrives back in Phoenix. He applies to Columbia, but it's too late for early decision. The Columbia coach supports Joe's application, and admissions then notifies the coach that they will begin reading Joe's application after winter break as they are focused on finishing their decisions for the early decision class. So this isn't unusual that there are certain points in time during the year when the admissions department is so busy with something else that they can't or they're not willing to produce a likely letter at that time. When they're making decisions on the early decision class, that's one of them. And also, as they're getting close to making decisions on the regular decision class, they're not going to pause to issue a likely letter. They're just going to make you wait at that point to hear whether or not you were admitted with the early decision class or later if you were admitted with the regular decision class. So in this case, they're not going to make Joe wait all the way until March to find out with the rest of the regular decision class, but they are going to make him wait through the winter holidays before they start to read his application. Joe also applies to Penn and ASU for regular decision as a backup if Columbia falls through. This is a great idea. So even though he's applying to Columbia regular decision and he's committing to going to Columbia if he is admitted, he's also putting in his application to two backup schools because realistically, if Penn still has a recruiting slot, they're going to give it to Joe. So that's great. And ASU is probably still going to be there as a backup. Remember, some of the aid that Joe was getting was actually academic aid. So it still could be an option for him, even if both the Ivy League schools fall through. January. Columbia issues a likely letter to Joe in early January. He's good to go. In March, Joe is accepted with the regular decision class at Columbia. So he's done. Joe did a great job through this recruiting process once it kind of got underway and people found him. The thing he didn't do a great job with was being easily searchable and having an online persona that can allow college coaches to get a hold of you. Once he got underway, he worked it really, really well and he found the exact school that he wanted to go to. Pro tip. It's good to call any coaches that you have had significant communication with to let them know that you've committed elsewhere. You are likely to see them at meets in the future, and if you ghosted them or just texted them, it might be awkward to run into them, and no one needs that when they're trying to compete. You don't want to be seeing this coach that also recruited you and you ghosted them, and now you feel uncomfortable while you're at a meet. Additionally, if you graduate from undergrad and you still have more eligibility to compete, Joe might go for 4 years at Columbia and still have another year of eligibility. And that might be the perfect opportunity to go to ASU and compete for that coach. You don't want to burn any bridges. You want to take care of your reputation the best you can because it helps you to keep options open. And this process all worked out very, very well for Joe because once he got underway with the recruiting process, he had pretty nice results. The big issue was that he wasn't searchable, he wasn't easy to find for college coaches, and he wasn't very proactive. Once the process got underway, he started being proactive and he did a great job. But one of the reasons things worked out so well for him, even despite the fact that he was unsearchable online and very hard to find for college coaches, is that Joe had run 1065 in the 100. If Joe had run 1085 in the 100, then he likely wouldn't have achieved the perfect outcome for him in the college search because people aren't going to go out of their way to move mountains for somebody who's run 1085 like they would for somebody who's run 1065. The better you are, the more mistakes you can make and still end up in a good place. The closer you are to the standards, or if you fall below the standard, the more on your game you need to be to get your best outcome.